Cool. So thanks for coming. I guess we're good to go. Got a small room, and of the 12 or 13 people in here, I know 4 or 5 of you. So that leaves about 9 that can actually ask questions, and not harass me. But anyways, what I thought we would chat about is this is kind of a foundational thing. So it's good to do this first in the day and first in the 2-day sequence. Is a little bit about what are some of the risks that are involved in putting data in the cloud, which for some people is something that they come up to and say, I can't do this. It's in the cloud. It's out of my control. What am I going to do about that? And for others, it doesn't really matter too much to them, or they don't give it as much thought. So what we'll do is we'll talk about what some of those risks are, and then we'll talk about some of the controls that Microsoft in particular has available to mitigate some of those risks. And to that end, if you do have a question, especially this is a really small room, just jump in. It's kind of boring just to stand up here and talk for the next hour, so by all means make this interactive, make this what it'll be to be useful to you. So just kind of by way of intro, like I said, my name's Brian Desmond. I work for a consulting firm based out of Chicago called Ravenswood Technology Group, and what we do is, or a large part of what we do is actually implement what we're going to talk about around some of Microsoft's controls for Azure and for Office 365, and kind of as Gil was talking about in the keynote. Used to do a lot of AD work, so that's kind of where my background is. I wrote O'Reilly's Active Directory book. It's still reasonably relevant, especially for those of you that are still doing things on premises, which is probably everyone, despite what the.
I have it right here.
Oh, well, cool. The coffee fund thanks you. Anyways, email address is on the bottom. If you've got questions or want to follow up, feel free to reach out. I'm usually pretty good about getting back to emails. All right. So in terms of what I wanted to talk about, and I kind of alluded to this or got a little ahead of myself. How have things changed? What are some of the risks that either have always been there and we haven't thought about it, or that are new and that we need to apply controls to? And a lot of the ways I look at Microsoft's Enterprise Mobility Suite, which is what a lot of what we're going to talk about is just a set of controls to manage risk. So we'll talk about what those are, and at the end, if it all sounds interesting and you don't have it, how to make your Microsoft salesman happy. So the way I usually explain this is that it used to be we had this thing called the firewall, and everything that we cared about was on the inside, everything we didn't care about was on the outside, and we could say, you know what, you can't even take your laptop and take it outside, you won't be able to get to anything. And that was all well and good, and it made things good especially for the control freaks, right? Because they could just say you can't do anything, we have it all back here. And as this whole mobility things come about and people want to work from home, they want to work from their iPad, they want to work on the go, that started making it a lot harder, because now how do we let those devices in? I work with some organizations that have taken the approach that we'll just say no to all that. And as the workforce evolves, that tends to not work very well when you tell everybody that they've got to use this clunky brick that you got from Lenovo or something that's got 29 agents on it, and you need to sit in this cube that's this tall and be connected to the network. And then when we started putting data in the cloud, in Office 365, Salesforce, pick your favorite flavor of cloud application came about, suddenly that whole firewall thing just got out of the mix, and we lost that ability to have that control. So what do we do about this is kind of the question. And I think what you'll see as we look about how can we manage the risks that come with this is who do we want to allow to access it? We have to know who they are. Now it's not just about where they are. Where can be an input, what network they're connected to, what they're coming from, but it's who it is, what device they're using, where they're coming from. All these things, when you compound all that together, now we can make intelligent decisions about whether or not we allow people to access data, to access different services. And kind of the list of risks you can come up with that come with this are pretty endless if you put your mind to it. I picked a few that we'll talk about here. Compromised credentials is one that I think is familiar with everyone. I know I certainly get emails periodically from major sites that I use that say, we might have misplaced your username and password. You should probably think about changing it. I don't know if anyone else has gotten one of those, but it kind of tends to happen. Data loss, data leakage. If you read the papers these days, at least in the U.S., there's been no shortage of that coming from various organizations in Washington. But that probably applies to your organization too, and probably the methods that happen apply as well. And then there's the easy ones that have been around forever. I lost my laptop. I left it at the airport. I left my phone at the bar after a long night, or at least I think I left it there. Not really sure where it is. And of course, regulatory compliance is always a fun one that, especially here in New York, financial services, healthcare, all those different industries, we deal a lot with. And in Europe, GDPR is the new hot button thing to talk about these days. So as far as creds go, passwords suck, right? Like let's just be honest about that. They've always sucked. It's just taken us a long time for it to be something that we're all willing to come to grips with. You can get stolen credential lists on the internet. They're out there. They're for sale. The people that steal them are making good money by selling them, and you'd be surprised who's buying them as well to create some useful capabilities in Azure. We'll talk a little bit about how Microsoft actually uses some of those lists, but before, when it was something was behind the firewall, at least, hey, it's behind the firewall. I sort of have to get through there. Maybe we do two-factor to get into VPN or something like that, and then it's a username and password. But now when all those resources are exposed directly to the internet, I was talking to, I forget, someone right before we started that was talking about how when they stand up new virtual machines in Azure or AWS, they come up, they're on the internet, they've got the remote desktop port open, they've got a really crappy password, and within seconds those machines are compromised. And that's a great example of where usernames and passwords are really bad. It's albeit a little contrived, but shows you just how quickly people take advantage of that. It's working, yeah. And then as far as devices go, so everybody here, half of you've got laptops. You might or might not be taking notes on this or appearing to be interested with them, but you've probably got interesting stuff about your jobs on there. Hopefully the devices are BitLockered or encrypted or something like that, but believe me, there are more than a few organizations that would probably scare you that haven't quite gotten to that step yet. And now when all that data doesn't live on the server and you take it with you, you leave it somewhere, chances are maybe someone that finds that lost laptop is a good Samaritan and just sends it back to you, or maybe they decide to go for a little browse through it before they do that, or you never see it again. But that question that you get, especially when you look at audits and things like that, where the question is, so where is my data? That's a really difficult question to answer, and I would venture to guess that nobody in here could actually answer that question with a straight face. And so if you can't answer that question, then what do I do about the data? Because if I can control the data and who has access to it, what they're doing with it, then I don't have to worry about necessarily where the data is so much as who can do something with it and what. Good, guys? Okay. And then, of course, so I've got that data now. How do I just make sure that the right people have access to it? Because if I don't have to worry about where it is or who has access to it, but I can control who can actually look at it. So I should say I can control who has access to it. Now I can control not only the where problem, but when that data makes it out onto the internet, it makes it onto cloud services that someone buys with their corporate Amex because IT can't get their act together quick enough. So why don't I just go to salesforce.com and sign up for that subscription that solves all my problems, and of course now IT has no ability to control that data. So if I know who has access to it, maybe I know where it's being accessed from, I can keep track of it, and I don't have to care as much about where it actually lives. And then, of course, you layer on what are the regulatory compliance obligations that I have. You've always had those obligations, albeit there's new ones coming out, especially in Europe is a big issue right now. But if you layer that on top of what you're doing with the cloud, it's not so much of, well, I have to comply with these rules, so I can't put any data in the cloud, so much as, well, let's look at what those rules are. Let's look at the controls I have, and how can I extend those so that they actually apply to what I'm doing in the cloud today. And you'll find that I think a lot of them, it tends to be that they're very simple changes to controls, or not even changes at all, so much as something that you've already got, and it's just thinking about it in a different way.
Do you want to give an example of those compliance rules that you think about, Ryan?
Yeah, do you have one in mind? Since you're baiting me with the...
No, I think it's for bank companies and plenty of other companies, it's all about auditability. Yeah, a lot of that is like just being able to trace where things are, and like just mentioned before, knowing where your data is and who has permission to access it. Yeah, it's all this auditability, and I think that's the key. It's not so much. Is it a problem to host things in the cloud, or is it a problem to host things on premise? But if you don't know how to control it, then you're screwed.
Yep.
And don't know how to audit it. Yeah. So, and I think it's just a new challenge to audit properly in the cloud.
Yeah, absolutely.
Case in point, I work for a healthcare organization. One of the reasons why we will probably never be fully cloud oriented, aside from the size, is anything associated with patient records has to be fully audited. It has to exist in a data center within the country that it originates.
Yep.
Can't guarantee that. Nor can it be effectively audited currently based upon the access point, be it the credit card based application that was popped up or some other resource. So,
Does that mean you won't use cloud at all?
we do, but only on certain services and for limited users. Like if it's a clinician, they don't do anything cloud oriented. Like their emails, they will never be open 365.
Yeah, but that's why Microsoft is also adapting, not Brian, but Microsoft, with what are they calling them? Those trusted cloud areas.
Oh, yeah,
specific
Right, yeah,
systems
and you can
hosted in
you can
Germany
define your data
nowadays.
center,
Yeah.
et cetera. Yeah,
And
we've
whatnot.
seen those, and we're like, yeah, that's nice. We're still not moving.
I know. It's I think it'll take a while to get there, and then of course the whole encryption piece, which
Yeah,
is critical to actually.
yeah. There are numerous things. Our big push right now is probably we're just really waiting on a lot of things to figure out. Maturization of ADOL, amongst other things. Active Directory for many years has been a backbone of a lot of what we do. And migrating some of those philosophies into a cloud space is possible in some ways, but very difficult in others. Technology is not entirely there. So we want to move, but at the same time, we don't want to move because what we really need is not there yet.
So it sounds like your concern is not so much that Microsoft says that they will keep your data in the country, but you have no way to independently verify that?
That's part of it.
Because they will sign agreements and show you their compliances and stuff. We've seen all that too. But
There is a matter, for instance, if you want to take it another step further, you can just simply monitor firewall logs. You've been able to identify probably 7,000 different transactions of people just popping up a cloud tendency. Now, the issue there is, okay, draconian, we'll just cut those ports off. Bam, you're done. But what happens if that's already become a business critical application and breaks something, be it patient, business, financial, whatever? It's got to be a balance. And so in some areas in which we do have a level of control, we just say it's sort of almost a level of analysis by paralysis and paralysis by analysis at this point. So we know we have to do this, but we're kind of afraid to move at this point because we know the consequences.
so the risk from your point of view is not so much that like the main focus tool is not something you can handle, but the fact that it's so easy for somebody to get a credit card and bypass it.
That's part of it. There's also the matter of we're kind of getting off.
Yeah,
There's the matter of control.
Right.
Well, it's identifying who did what.
Yeah.
Control is not even the biggest issue. There are ways to address that. It's who did what.
I don't want to
Yeah.
derail you too much more, but I'm curious, does anyone here besides me have a significant presence in the Philippines? GDPR. So probably you don't care if you don't have a presence in the Philippines, but GDPR is, I just found out about this from one of my vendors. It's fascinating, especially since I have like 40,000 employees in the Philippines. It's GDPR, but with prison sentences for the senior executives.
Did you say prison?
Prison. Oh, wow. Prison. Yes, it comes with not just fiscal penalties. So, yeah. But if you're not in the Philippines, just like keep going.
So
we must never planning vacation now.
Yeah. So that might be something we actually need to get on our acronym list at very minimum. But anyway.
Yeah,
back to you.
Good discussion. I think this is great. So on that note, let's see if this thing's still live. Yep. So if you can't put stuff in the cloud or you're not sure about whether it's going to meet the requirements that you have, what controls can you wrap around it to start meeting those? And the first one I like to talk to everyone about is putting two-factor or multi-factor in front of that. I seem to talk about this in some ways less and in some ways more. It kind of depends on who you're talking about. Certainly talking to my family about it is still something that they're trying to get over the fact that they can't just use that crappy 6-letter password and they actually have to pull their phone out every time they log into something. And depending on the industry that you work in, that may or may not be the same discussion that you're having with your workforce. That said, Microsoft's solution, which probably everyone in this room has used in some sense or another, is Azure MFA or Azure Multi-Factor. If you just own Office 365, you get MFA out of the box, and also you get it for free because you've already paid them for the O365 services. But just for those Office 365 workloads, you get MFA. If you want to have conditions about when you use that, and we'll talk about what that looks like. They of course that costs a little bit more. The trick with MFA though is not figuring out how to implement it technically. It's planning it and communicating it. If you communicate this and plan this out, this is one of those IT projects where it's 80 or 90% planning and communication and 10% technology. There's only a few knobs that you get to set. But if you don't have people prepared for this and ready for it, there will be a bit of hell to pay. Has been my experience with this. Aside from just communicating, hey, this is coming and this is why it's important, and the this is why it's important part is really important, for lack of a better word there. If you don't message that in a way that people understand, here's why you're interrupting my day or my workflow, that's where the blowback tends to come out of these. In terms of planning for it though, what changes? The first choice you get to make is how people are actually going to do MFA with the Azure solution. You've got really 3 different choices. One is they can get a phone call to their phone, and the great thing about that is that there's practically no moving parts. Telephones have worked the same way for forever. And in terms of things that are going to go wrong or break, phone call tends to be the one that doesn't have any of those variables. So usually when we roll this out, we say that phone call is one of the things you're going to offer. Some of our customers actually only offer phone call to begin with, just because they don't have to worry about any of the other BS that comes with people making changes to their devices. All they have to do is get a phone call, they press the pound sign, and they're on their way. Text message is another option. The problem with text messages is A, they're unreliable, B, they cost money for people depending on where you are, either to receive or to send them. And they also don't work with certain services, especially if you have to put that one-time code into something. If the application won't let you type that code in, you're kind of out of luck. And then the last one is the mobile app. The mobile app for me is what I like. I don't want to get the phone call. I just get the approve button on my phone and I push it. There are still in this day and age actually a segment of people that don't have smartphones. Is a recurring theme that we learn every time we do one of these projects.
Or don't have a company phone.
Or don't have a company phone, as may be the case in the U.S. at least. Most people don't have a company phone anymore, but yeah.
And then you get that well, I don't want to use my private phone for that type of work type of situation.
Yeah. So the trick there is having more than one way for people to get verified. The phone call is the least common denominator. They still need a phone, but even that flip phone that has the 9 buttons and the T9 texting will work out for that. And the mobile app is kind of the more sophisticated method. So typically we'll choose voice call and mobile app, but this is just one of those choices that you get to make as you're planning this. And
You
whether
have to
you
pick one or the other, or
you do not have to pick one or the other, so it can be any of the above or all of the above.
do most do all the above, or
What's that?
do most people do all the above? Or?
Most of our customers do voice call and mobile app. Text message has its challenges for a variety of reasons. Delivery is one of those. The U.S. government has come out in the past year or so and said that text messages aren't quite as secure as we thought.
Yes.
So from a NIST compliance perspective, that's another potential audit risk with it as well.
We haven't actually seen auditors say no yet. It's just more like on the maybe you shouldn't. But yeah, we're still using it extensively. We're still admiring the problem of text message, I would say.
Well, banks are still using them, so.
Yeah,
Sure, yeah.
Well,
Yes, it's all about how you read into it.
It's hard to pull back once you deployed it and you have
it works without the bond.
Yeah, it's hard to understand your dependence on it. Most systems will let you see how many text messages you're sending, and which just makes it even seem like you definitely can't turn it off because it's not zero, and it's usually a lot.
And then, another big change is, especially depending on what version of Office you're on, you have to turn this thing called modern authentication on, which I think you might have a session on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Should plug, dude.
And modern authentication changes the way, if you haven't worked with this, the way that the Office apps in particular authenticate to Office 365. They go from using what's under the covers called an active endpoint, where they actually relay your username and password to it, to being smart enough to do federated authentication effectively in a nice little web pop-up. And the nice thing about the web pop-up is Microsoft can control what that authentication looks like. It's not just username and password now. So now we can do that MFA prompt, for example, in that sign-in screen. But this means a change that you have to make from a group policy perspective on all your Office clients. If you're on versions of Office prior to Office 2013, there is no modern authentication. So there's an upgrade path or a project that has to happen as a prereq to rolling MFA out for those. And then mobile clients also have problems with that. iOS just came out with a new native mail client that does modern authentication. So as of a few weeks ago, it doesn't have the same issue where you can't do the MFA prompt when you're signing into your mail client. But if people aren't on those versions, or they're on Android clients that don't support this, it's also getting them transitioned to the Outlook app from the iOS mail app. And that tends to have its own challenges that come with it. I use the Outlook app, it works perfectly fine for me, but anyone that's been using the iOS mail app forever and then they switch to Outlook will probably be in some state of pissed off when you tell them they have to switch to Outlook, and you multiply that by however many thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people, and it's a project in itself to get that rolled out. Or you say, well, I can't figure out organizationally how to do that, so now I'll turn off MFA for that entry point, and now you start creating holes in the facade. So that's again, this is all planning and all the prerequisite projects that come with it. Not so much just turning MFA on. And then finally, training your help desk or service desk. This is another one that people tend to forget. There will be all sorts of calls that they will get about how to change this. I lost my phone. How do I enroll my device? How do I block the mobile app that was on that device, and so forth. So again, it's just all about planning. And then the next question that inevitably comes up is if you make people do MFA too many times, they will start getting really annoyed with the process. There becomes this fatigue that becomes associated with it. So as soon as you've got this great thing out there and you're like, hey, we now have two-factor, we're not just relying on usernames and passwords, you start thinking about, well, how do I reduce the number of times people need to do MFA to the times when I'm not sure who they are or where they're coming from? One of the ways you can do that with Azure AD, with Active Directory, is this concept of known devices, where your domain joined devices actually sync to Azure AD, which is the same directory that O365 uses. And you can start making decisions now based on, do I know anything about this device? Or if you're using Intune, is this a compliant device? And based on that, you might say that, well, I really only want to do two-factor when someone's coming from a device that's either not known or that isn't compliant, for example, as opposed to saying they need to do two-factor every single time they connect to the service. In in terms of turning this on, Windows 10 devices, they know exactly how to do this. There's a couple group policy changes that you make, and they'll go off and register themselves, and there's not a whole lot you have to do. Windows 7 and 8.1 devices, they actually need an entire package that has to be pushed down. So now there's a little bit of a logistics question there from a desktop management perspective of how you get that package pushed down. And there's a couple other group policy changes that come along with this. Prior to very recently, you had to have ADFS for this to work. If you're not using ADFS with Azure AD, this now works as well. But either way, so Windows 10 devices, they do this out of the box. Windows 7 and 8.1 devices have a couple dependencies. And then there's a mostly undocumented command there called dsreg command that on Windows 10 at least will give you some insight into what's happening with that process if you're trying to troubleshoot it. And so known and compliant devices are great if you own the device or people are willing to let you own the device. In terms of laptops and PCs, that seems fairly straightforward, especially if it's hardware you're providing. But with mobile devices, so phones and tablets, when it's someone's personal device, they tend to not be as receptive to you owning that device and controlling what happens on it. What's that?
No idea why that would be.
Yeah, no idea why, says the German. So from a how do I manage this perspective, you have to kind of step back and say, what do I actually care about on the device? Do I care that the device has a PIN and whatever other miscellaneous settings we push down to it are there? Do I really care about what the data is that lives on the device? And for most people, most of the time, they really just care about what the data is. And so one way to look at this is, well, what if I just manage the apps that are on the device rather than caring about the device itself? As long as the device can run the apps and the apps have my policies, then I'm good and I'll let those in. So with Intune, Microsoft has this concept of mobile application management. And the idea here is that I can take a device that's either completely unmanaged or that's managed with a third-party MDM solution. So you could layer this on with an AirWatch or a mobile iron or something like that, and then layer Intune just for the apps on. And with the apps, and this is mainly the Office apps, as well as there's a handful of third parties, Acrobat's an example, one that's plugged into this as well. You can say that here's the things that I can do with the data that's within this specific application. So I can move it to another managed app. I can copy and paste from Word to Excel or from Outlook to Word, for example, because that's corporate data. But when I try to take that to my personal Gmail that's also on my phone or save it to my Google Drive, it'll go ahead and block that. So now I'm in control of the data, and I can control how people connect with those apps to the Office 365 services, but I don't have to own the rest of the end user's device. And there's a relatively small number of things that you can do with these policies, these mobile application management policies, or they're now in the new UI they've been rebranded as application protection policies. Call them what you want. They do the same thing, but the key things are, where can I take the data? Can I put them in or out of managed apps? Can I require someone to have a PIN or to even re-authenticate to access those? And this is good, because if I'm not going to require a PIN on the device, but I want some basic level of assurance about who's accessing the data, I can say that you can do whatever you want on your phone, but when you go into the mobile apps, you actually have to enter a PIN. Or you can also require them to re-authenticate with corporate creds. That tends to be a little draconian, but the choice is there if you want to do that. And then I think the other important thing here is that when you go to wipe the data, because either someone's left the company or they've lost their device, whatever the case may be, you're just wiping the corporate data that's within those apps. You leave all their pictures of their kids and their music, everything else that's on their phone stays with them, so that risk or that perception that, well, I'm going to control the device or going to wipe everything on my device goes away with that.
Have you actually done many MAM deployments yet in your work?
I've done one. MAM only.
Gotcha. It's a really, really fascinating technology. We're super excited about it. It's also like road being paved as we speak kind of thing as well. So definitely a work in progress. But yeah, I mean, from my perspective, it's like the right model to deal with personally owned devices.
we're seeing the same thing with a lot of our customers. That whole topic of, bring your own device has a totally different connotation with laptops and whatnot. But at least for the mobile devices, like you say, it remains mostly under your control, except for the apps and data that the company needs. And I think what's worth mentioning, of course, the policies allow you to also hinder copy paste of data. Of course, they cannot hinder taking a screenshot and whatnot. Yeah, that type of stuff. But it's still, it's compromise. It's been compromise.
Yep. I thought they could actually hinder taking a screenshot with MAM. Maybe not.
Can't print or forward things, right?
Yeah,
No,
you can't copy
control
out
that,
of.
but there's
You could still put a camera in front of
there's
it.
even with the data protection services for PCs, you can also hinder the classic screenshot. But there's always methods that you can get that those binary data. Even if you just take another camera today. So there's obviously ways around that, but that's always going to be there. Yeah. If people can even just read it off the screen and tell it to people on the phone, whatnot. So I mean, you can't protect all knowledge or information to be passed on, but you can do the best compromise. It's always a compromise.
Yeah, I mean, anyone that's determined is going to find, if there's a will, there's a way, right?
Yeah.
If it's that hard, most people won't tolerate it.
Yeah, right. It's the hindrance for the 90 whatever it's percentile, but the guy that's on the dole to get this data, he's going to figure out how to do it, right?
Yeah, but you make it hard.
Yeah.
And you basically protect your users from doing stupid things. I think that's the key.
Yep, and it's also, when someone does go do it, so you actively went around these 15 roadblocks that we put in front of you to do this, it becomes really hard to say, well, I didn't know, or I didn't mean to, or
It becomes conform to some of those policies.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. The other thing that the MAM policies do that I just kind of incidentally thought of is that they're also smart enough within the Office apps to know the personal side of the app from the corporate side. So if you have your personal email and your work email in the Outlook app, it's smart enough to not apply any of those controls when you're working in your personal, your Outlook.com, your Gmail, whatever. But as soon as you switch to the corporate side of the app, it starts applying those controls. So it's that kind of minimal thin layer where you control what you care about, and you leave everything else, kind of in the wind.
Is that new? Because I thought for a while it didn't do that. It kind of, like, you could only have the corporate side and your personal side kind of went away. Or is that something that...
It's been there for a while.
Okay.
Some of the apps took longer to catch up, but they all have it. All the MAM managed apps, say that quickly, have that capability today.
Okay, thanks.
I think the Microsoft Office mobile versions, they pretty much had it from the start. Pretty sure, yeah. But you, of course, you need to have the controls in place, like Intune. Not sure which other tools give the control with those apps if you're using AirWatch or whatnot. Is it going to do the same?
No, so it's a closed ecosystem, right? So if you're using AirWatch and you want to get this, you get to pay again for Intune, and you can use them both at the same time. But Microsoft they own the Office apps everyone wants to use, and so they own the APIs to manage those as well.
You can also, if you have your own corporate mobile apps, you can integrate them with MAM. There's a whole SDK for building that in for those who have that. I don't know if anyone has that besides us, but we've got actually a bunch.
We've got an interesting scenario that we've been looking at lately where we deal with what are called shared mailboxes, in which we don't necessarily, the end user, is it going to be required? Actually, there has to be an authentication function, right? But we don't want them to know the password. And we're kind of debating upon how best to approach that. In other words, you have a company-owned device, it has to be set up, but we don't want to provide the password for that end user.
Can you just delegate access to the mailbox to the individual user?
Yeah, but what we have found is at some point, let's say there's a blip, there's something, and then they come up and it's asking for a password. We've thought about doing some things potentially with certificates, but at the same time, we're not even sure if, for instance, the device du jour, of course, is Apple. We're not even sure if the Microsoft Outlook app even supports a shared
It doesn't today.
account concept.
Supports shared calendars as of a couple weeks ago.
Really?
Yeah.
But not shared mailboxes.
Yeah.
And see, that's what we were wondering. We haven't gotten an answer back on that. So there's my answer.
And that's an important mobility use case
Yeah.
as well, not just a desktop use case.
Yeah, and that's what. And see, what I just found out a couple of weeks ago is we have a lot of clinicians, physicians, not necessarily employees. Effectively, they're contractors. Instead of them using their personal devices, we're like, fine, we're going to provide you with a device. So you just purchased 80,000 from Microsoft. So they said, hey, you're going to use these. So I think that's their way of saying, okay, we feel comfortable, you can be device joined, you can do these, et cetera, et cetera. But then you still have circumstances such as this where it's going to be a shared mailbox. Yeah.
Interesting.
You manage the device, but you still have the data to worry about.
You purchased devices from Microsoft? Did I hear you just say?
No,
Oh,
Apple.
Okay, I was about to say.
Yeah, no, our CIO is an Apple fanboy, so it's
Gotcha.
Apple. No, yeah. If it had been Microsoft, I'd been like, how did they do that?
I don't think they sell them anymore.
No, I don't think they do either.
I have a Windows phone sitting on my desk at home. It crashes randomly, doing nothing.
Shut up.
I tried to love it so much, but it wouldn't love me back.
Yeah.
Sounds
Gave
familiar.
up loving a year ago, yeah.
Yeah, I gave my Windows phone up, a year and a half ago. I dropped it in Redmond, walked into the Microsoft store, I was like, what can you do for me? And they're like, we can sell you a new one at face value. I was like, no, that ship has sailed. So everything we talked about, so when we talked about MFA, we talked about known devices, we talked about compliant and managed devices with Intune. These are all controls that feed into a capability in Azure AD Premium called conditional access. And what conditional access lets you do is this is where we can take all these things rather than just looking at them piecemeal and saying I need everyone to have a known device or I need them to use two-factor. We can start making decisions about things like if I want to access Exchange Online, I need to either do multi-factor or I need to come from a known device. Or if I want to access ActiveSync, I have to come from a managed and compliant device. And you start layering these together, and you can say when applications can be accessed. There's actually a feature that if anyone has hourly workforces, especially in retail, where you can say what time windows people can access is actually something that's new there. And then you layer that on top of what devices they're coming from, what networks they're coming from, whether those devices are managed and compliant, whether or not they did two-factor or multi-factor. You wire all these together, and now you can start making these decisions and put these controls in place for all these different cloud applications. And while we've kind of talked about this in the context of Office 365, this applies to any application that you can integrate with Azure AD. So any app that can be federated with it, whether it's in their gallery or not, you can wrap these conditional access policies around that data and around those applications. And then the fourth control that you get there, which I usually call out separately because it's really interesting, is something called identity protection that Microsoft has. And what this does is every single time you sign into Azure AD, Microsoft is looking at all these different signals. There's over 100 of them that they apply to every single sign-in to assign a risk score to that sign-in. And based on those risk scores, you can use that as an input to your conditional access decisions and say, well, if this is a high-risk sign-in, then I'm going to require multi-factor. I might even require them to reset their password. Whereas if it's a low-risk sign-in, maybe I'm not going to require anything. And one of the many inputs to that high-risk decision is whether or not that credential has potentially been compromised. And so...
Or the IP address is Russian.
Yep.
Where do you come from?
Yep. IP addresses are another input. Another thing that's new as of a couple weeks ago is the ability to apply conditional access policies based on the country that the IP address is coming from. So if you only have people in the U.S., you can actually say that we're only going to allow access from the U.S. Or maybe we're consistently getting hammered from IPs in Russia, for lack of a better example. We're just going to block all access from there.
Have they ever published what their risks are defined? I mean, based on?
they've never published the full list of all the things that they look at, no.
It's
And
also, it's machine learning based.
Yeah.
They're constantly tweaking the model, so.
Yeah, it changes day in and day out.
Okay.
And they're super cagey about it. They don't want to expose a lot of the actual like numerical stuff. So, yeah, good luck.
Yeah.
You did this. I think this is a really cool feature, and but you definitely are just like you're taking the blue pill a little bit and assuming that they're really clever. But I think you just got to do it. So.
Oh no, there's some nice things. I really wasn't so much concerned about the hard specifics, but I was thinking more categories.
Mhm.
What are the areas that you're
Yeah, some of the categories are broadly defined. At least they actually have a playbook in the documentation for how you can trigger it to hit the different risk scores, and you can kind of fill in the blanks, right? Because when it tells you to open up a Tor browser, which is a way to
Okay.
anonymize where you're coming from, so they're never going to tell you all the tricks in the book, right? No different than the government not telling you all the ways they secure the White House or whatever, right? But there's some broad-based things that you can infer. One of the ones that I like to point out, because it's a little subtle or not well known, is if you use ADFS, how many people federate with Azure AD or Office 365 today? And put your hand down if you're not doing password hash synchronization and federating at the same time.
not doing it? Yeah.
Not doing it. So you're missing out on this really cool feature called finding the credentials that have been compromised. Because what Microsoft does is, even though you're not using those password hashes to authenticate, and remember when it syncs the hash, it doesn't actually take the hash from AD,
Right.
it takes it and it rehashes it. They actually run that against all the compromised credentials that they buy from all these third parties that have stolen them and put them on the internet. So just by turning that password hash synchronization on, even if you continue to use ADFS or ping or however you federate with Office 365, you get that reporting capability. You start finding out whose usernames and passwords on your network have been compromised and are available for purchase on the internet. So it's one of those things I tell everyone, like, even if you still want to use federation, that's great. Let's go turn this on so that we can start getting this telemetry, getting this data, because that's data you're going to get nowhere else.
I wonder if it doesn't create like an issue where people will be stealing the passwords because they know that Microsoft are going to buy them,
As far as,
getting money out of it.
they don't sell them just, like, these are sold for anyone that'll buy them, right?
Yeah.
I mean, they have consumers, so yeah, it's interesting that some of them are corporate. It's hard to imagine that would actually change the market. There being so many corporate customers that it would actually change the economics of it really in a huge way. But I mean, I guess there is some benefit there as well too. They are sort of feeding in a way. I kind of see what you're saying.
So what's this feature called?
It's called, there's a leaked credentials report.
Leaked credentials, as
Yeah.
part of
Azure AD Premium. And they run all the lists that they purchase against all the credentials that are in Azure AD.
What's the budget they have for buying?
Who buys these?
Microsoft buys them.
Buys
through
what?
They buy
Alex,
them from the dark web.
Alex
Yeah,
buys
yeah,
Bitcoin
yeah.
wallet.
Yeah.
It's actually
They buy them like off the dark web?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Selling them
Yeah.
for-
So as a part, to help protect customers, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So,
it is.
so it's like, so you know the website Have I Been Pwned, where you can go and type in your email address?
What's it called?
HaveIBeenPWND.com. You can type in your email address and it'll tell you whether it was
Right,
leaked.
right.
So if you build that, check into Azure AD, that's basically what Microsoft is doing. Because that guy's vacuuming up those same lists and, basically every email address in the world is on it. But it's a really neat capability.
So-
It's really effective.
One of the things that I think is really cool about this feature too is that I don't know if anyone is looking at the NIST rules around or the NIST recommendations around passwords and admiring the problem about maybe moving to non-expiring passwords. But one of the
Yeah.
controls that they recommend as a compensating control is becoming aware of when your user's credentials are compromised. And so from my perspective, my gateway to be able to actually move my organization to non-expiring user credentials is will be justified by having this capability, because I'll be able to say, hey, look, I can tell if somebody's password's been compromised, and I'll be able to actually take that to my auditors. So this is actually part of my story for how I'm going to try and drive that internally, because I actually think the non-expiring credential model is better. It's going to be a tough slog for my org. I think I may die trying to do this. But from my perspective, this is the feature that gives you that control for your auditor, and you are already paying for it potentially.
You said you want to go for non-expiring by doing what to
So,
find out?
in the NIST recommendations, one of the things that they suggest is that you have a way to, you focus on looking for accounts that have been compromised and making people change passwords around that. So you don't change passwords unless you think they're compromised. And so this is a way that you can go to your auditors and say, this is the thing that we do to find out if people's passwords have been compromised. There's probably other things you can do as well.
When you
but
said this, are you referring to the synchronizing the hashes?
Yes, so the leak credentials report, which is enabled by synchronizing the hashes, gives you a report of people's whose accounts have been, or whose passwords are somehow known to the public internet. So there's a dance with your auditors that goes into these conversations as much as an actual security conversation, but you have to be able to get in front of your auditors and be able to say where the controls are coming from, and that's like a feature that you're already paying for.
And the thing that's what's interesting to mention here is that at the same time that NIST provided a recommendation, which was like I think a year and a half ago, more or less at the same time Microsoft came out with their recommendation, and it was pretty much the same.
Yep.
Yeah, because they also proposed not locking the accounts either, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, well, that can take down the company pretty
Yeah,
easy.
well, and really, I had to create a compromise. They wouldn't. That was kind of my recommendation. Eventually, it was like, okay, only service accounts and highly privileged accounts will not lock. Everything else will. So they kind of met me in the middle.
Have we derailed you completely? Are you all right?
Yeah, we're good.
Fast unlocking.
Conditional access.
Yep.
Do they have mechanisms built in to make that easy to manage? Like if I've got like 10 or 15 different profiles of factory workers or whatnot, is it easy to manage, or am I writing custom scripts to?
No, it's all so the question is it easy to manage? I've got lots of profiles. So the wonders of the cloud is that there is no more, like scripts and custom glue right under that you have to manage. It's all managed through the Azure portal, and you create different policies and you target them to either groups or apps.
You might talk to Maris a little bit on the CA stuff. It's actually a lot on the CA stuff, especially device auth. Although I wasn't really going to talk a whole lot about the policy framework itself, but we definitely can. There's also a talk on this later today, I think. If you want to learn more on that, I think that's John Sable's.
Yeah, I think so.
Talk.
Yep. Yeah. So as you layer this together, you take all these different conditions. So who's the user? What app are they accessing? Where are they coming from? That could be, are they coming from known IP addresses? They're on the corporate network. Are they coming from specific countries? What do we know about their device? Is it actually managed or not? Is it compliant with our policies? And if you have identity protection, the risk score for their sign-in, and you can layer all these together, and based on that, you can make access decisions to different applications. You can decide whether or not they need to do two-factor authentication. You can even do things like, based on risk scores, force them to reset their password or block their sign-in altogether until you have a help desk or something like that intervene. So all that comes together with conditional access. And like I said, in terms of deploying this, you create what are called conditional access policies in Azure AD, and you can either target those to groups of users, groups of applications, or a combination of those. You can also create policies that say target every single user or every single app except this list. So you can, just depending on what your requirements are, simplify that quite a bit. And the last kind of work stream of the EMS suite that I thought I'd talk about a little bit is just around actually protecting data. And this is the one that tends to get the lawyers really excited and is really difficult to actually roll out in practice, because it involves people actually making decisions about what the data is and what people should do with it. And the first trick to this is usually, how do we classify data? And because if we can't classify the data, we've got no way to actually decide what we're going to do with it. The simpler you make this, the more likely people will actually do it. I've seen people with 3 different classifications. People get it. They can be like, this is A, B, or C. I've seen people with 20 or 30. The solution that people take to that is to do none of them because they don't understand it. I had one customer who will remain nameless, who actually built this like physical combobulator that you could pull out of your desk drawer and like line up the dots. It was like this little like abacus thing, and you would line up the different dots and pull the things out, and it would tell you what the classification of the data is based on the questions that you would answer.
See,
Is it?
This would fall completely under our governance team. It would be like, that's their job.
Yep.
Once they define it, it's up to us to figure out how to secure it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And so it's, either your governance organization or risk or legal is going to push it, or IT is going to push it and get them involved. The trick is to make it as simple as you can. Having the combobulator, while the person I worked with would dutifully pull it out of her drawer and line it all up and go, oh, this is high risk information. It'd be a lot simpler to just have 3 choices to make. Azure Information Protection, which used to be RMS, if you're familiar with that, is Microsoft's tool for this. AIP is a lot more than RMS used to be, so if you ever deployed RMS and realized it was a total pain in the ass to deploy and to manage and nobody used it, it's worth revisiting. They've made a lot of changes for the better and have layered a lot of new things on top of it. But the strategy now, rather than just encrypting data, is that you classify the data, and you do that by applying labels. In the Office apps, they all have this toolbar that you get to customize that's on top that has the different labels that you can apply. And then based on those labels, you can tell Azure Information Protection what you actually want it to do with the data. That can be doing nothing, that can be watermarking it, that can be applying encryption through RMS. You can also define rules that say if the data has these patterns in it, let's automatically classify it, and then based on that classification, we'll take action.
This is actually interesting because we had this conversation a few days back. One of the things that we saw as challenges in terms of deploying the old versions, put it that way, was as soon as you were starting to use it with other organizations beside yourself, it started to, as you call it, to be a pain in the ass. Is that solved? What you're seeing now?
Yeah, so sharing between organizations has gotten a lot better with AIP and RMS. It still has work to be done there, I think, but it works a heck of a lot better than it used to, and it's a key scenario now that they're actually addressing.
I think the key there is that you're finally able to do it across multiple companies, because they're all federating, or at least need to connect with Azure AD, instead of having some sort of peer-to-peer federation, which was a nightmare to do with RMS, right? So Azure Information Protection is at least building the platform that allows you to take the next step, but the most difficult thing remains, the classification of the data. If you have to rely on the users there, and that's I think where there's still a lot of let's say potential for further development and companies to interact to actually work with the with the Office suite and other applications to better perform that data classification. Because I don't think that rule set is powerful enough that Microsoft gives you there.
Yeah, they've actually in the past few weeks extended it so there's several hundred templates there now for automatic classification.
Have you looked at the last releases?
So the first couple releases, it had like 2 or 3. It had social security number, it had credit card number. They now have national ID numbers for pretty much every country, I think, in there, and it's a pretty sizable set now.
Yeah, not so much worried about the templates, but more the logic, because the sample with the credit card numbers and how often it is used, or how often that match this document contains a credit card. How often that occurs. Those are always used, just like the word confidential, right? Yep. And then they have a challenge when it says not confidential. Yeah, yep. that same rule. Yeah, and so this is where I think there's potential for other smart logic to add into this.
Yeah, it's the machine learning layer. What's the confidence level that this template actually applies?
Yeah.
That's something that Exchange and SharePoint have, but this doesn't have, right? So
Not
this
yet.
is,
Yeah.
where different teams are building the same thing and effectively need to come together.
Oh, you mean Microsoft? You mean Microsoft communicating between
Microsoft.
departments within Microsoft?
Oh wait,
That
I've
used
done
to
that before.
Yeah,
it used to
that
be.
never happens.
No.
So the labels trigger applying data protection with, if you've never used RMS before, what it does is it encrypts the document and then it attaches what's called a license to it, or you get a license to actually use it, and that defines what rights you have to both decrypt the data and then whether you can do it, so whether you can edit it or you can just view it, can you print, copy and paste, and so forth. And then the RMS client that's built into the operating system, as well as the Microsoft mobile apps, so the Office apps in particular, actually enforces that so that if you only have the ability to view, you won't be able to edit, you won't be able to copy and paste or print and so forth. And like we were talking about earlier, there's a will, there's a way you can get around it, but they make it pretty hard unless you're determined to get that data out. You can always pull your phone out and take a picture of the screen or something like that.
But it really has gotten powerful.
So, each of the things we've talked about are all part of what Microsoft calls their Enterprise Mobility and Security Suite. We've specifically talked about Azure AD Premium, which provides the identity management component, conditional access. The data protection and data classification is Azure Information Protection, and then the mobile device and mobile application management are all part of Microsoft Intune. The trick with these is you can buy them all a la carte as soon as you need 2 of them, which inevitably any of the use cases we've talked about combines at least 2, if not 3 of them. It becomes cheaper to buy the suite altogether. They have both EMS E3 and E5. E5 has some additional components that we didn't talk about on top of this, but this is all layered into the E3 component, which is either theirs, the individual EMS E3, or part of their Microsoft 365 offering. And with that, I think we are going to just about end on time here. So, just kind of wrapping this up, let's identify the risks, whether they're new risks, whether they're ones that we've always had. Let's either take our existing controls and apply those with no changes, or let's extend those to make those controls apply in the cloud as well. And the EMS offering is Microsoft's solution to this. Certainly, it's not the only solution that's out there, but it provides many of the controls that you're going to need to potentially meet your compliance and risk requirements as far as both Microsoft Office 365 as well as just general SaaS applications that are running in the cloud. And with that, thanks for listening. I'll be around here today and tomorrow. Would love to chat further and hope this was useful.
What's your take on Microsoft's contention that with Azure Active Directory Premium, you really don't need Okta or Ping or some of these other third-party? I know I'm opening up a can of worms here, but
yeah, I would agree. There's overlap there for sure, and there are many scenarios, especially with Office 365, that you can't meet without Azure Active Directory Premium. So if you're going to use Okta or you're going to use Ping 1 or something like that, that's fine.
if they say you don't need them, would you agree with that?
I would agree with that. Yeah, we do takeouts of those all the time.
You take them out?
Yep.
Because they're expensive?
They're expensive. There's overlap. Effectively, you're going to end up paying for both. Is where they're going to get you. It's the same thing with the MDM and the mobile application management. If you want to use a third-party one, that's totally fine. But if you want to manage the Office apps, you have to buy Intune.
What are the killer features that those guys still have that ends up having them stick around?
For Okta, the whole pitch was that you didn't have to set up ADFS, and they had the pass-through agent. Now that there's pass-through authentication, that kind of takes that pitch out.
Pass-through authentication in Azure Active Directory?
Yeah.
How about Ping? Harder conversation.
What's that?
Harder conversation.
Yeah, the thing I always find with people that have Ping is they've had Ping for a really long time before Microsoft had a strategy here or a solution, and Ping is very embedded.
I don't know, Okta has a lot of Fortune 500 customers, and their financials suggest they're doing pretty well.
Yeah, I would look at whether the financials suggest they're growing too.
A lot of companies, whenever you spend X amount of millions on a particular product, the idea then is, oh, no, that's what we're going to use, whether you like it or not.
Yeah, I mean, if it's capitalized, you have to use it for a period of
That,
time.
that's
and-
basically what's happened with Ping.
Yeah.
What do you mean? Ping's been embedded in our organization for probably, I'd say, 6-7 years now. So as Office 365, Azure has begun to mature, and ADFS is actually a viable federation solution now. When third parties come in and say, "Oh, well, our application is based on ADFS," our answer is, "Sorry, we're a Ping shop. You're going to adjust, or we're not using your product because we have X number of capital built into it, and we're not adjusting for you."
It's interesting because I always think of that now as being an Azure AD problem and not an ADFS or a Ping problem.
You know, honestly, they work so well. You know really what it comes down to? It just comes down usually to the application developer is not familiar with it. They did not develop for it. But our implementation of Ping is very core. OAuth, SAML, basic general protocols. We don't do heavy customization, so it works with, as long as you follow core federation controls, it's going to work.
Yeah.
It's just the endpoint didn't develop their application for Ping, so they panic and say it's not going to work.
But I think that to your point, that what you just described, that can explain Ping. The Okta piece, I think, is a bit different because they're not that old, and they are taking over in many organizations that we have conversation with. So I find it a bit hard to explain because I completely agree with the technical side of it, but I can't deny the reality of what we're seeing. So, I don't know.
Now, Okta is probably more of an identity management product. I had always heard. I've never really
It's a
worked
federation platform.
Is it? Okay.
And now they're doing like API-based, I guess, application-based authentication, something like that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a competitive space.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Brian.
Yeah.
All right.